Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the 401 Access Tonight podcast brought to you by Delinea. I'm the host of the show. My name is Joseph Carson, Chief Security Scientist and Advisory CISO at Delinea. And it's a pleasure. I'm always excited about episodes. We're bringing amazing guests on to talk about really top trends, topics, things that's really making a difference in the cybersecurity industry. Not other, do I have an awesome guest for you today, which I'm really excited to talk to and to learn. Because one of the things, my favorite things is it's always educational, not just for the listeners, but also for me. So I'm really excited. So Myrna, welcome to the podcast today. If you can give the audience a little bit of background about yourself, how you get into the industry, and maybe some fun things about yourself.
Absolutely. Well, first off, thank you for having me today. I've been looking forward to this for quite some time. Finally, the stars aligned, and you and I have this opportunity to chat. So I'm looking forward to it. So, as you mentioned, my name is Myrna Soto. My background, I've had the pleasure of being in the technology space for a little over 30 years. I always hate to say that number out loud, but it's the truth. Of that 30, about half, a little more than half, was spent dedicated in the area of cybersecurity. So I had the pleasure of being the Global CISO for a number of Fortune 100 organizations, of which we'll talk a little bit about later on. But most notably, I was the Global CISO for Comcast Corporation for about a decade, and had just an incredible journey with that organization, building a practice, sustaining a practice, and getting a ton of notoriety for the group and for the company in the space of cyber. Since then, I like to say I'm retired, but everybody that knows me well says that is just a farce. Since then, I'm doing a number of things. I have a portfolio of activities that I do right now. Primarily, I serve as a board member for a number of organizations. I'm a board member for 4 publicly traded organizations, 3 of which are considered critical infrastructure. And those listeners that are attuned to cyber understand what that means. That critical infrastructure has a very strong hold in the topical areas that we're going to be talking about. So it's a great mix of portfolio for me. And then I have the pleasure of serving on a number of privately held boards. And in full transparency, I'm a board member for Delinea, which is just an incredible organization I'm happy to be a part of and to keep engaged and involved closely within the cybersecurity space, both from the provider side and then, of course, from the consumer side with some of my public boards. Last but not least, I have an advisory firm where I advise and consult a number of clients. Usually these consultation practices are done either at the CISO level or at the executive management committee level, where I'm advising boards and executive suites regarding their cybersecurity, risk fabric, risk type of strategy within their organization, and get to tie all those things together now. So definitely not retirement, but it's a great chapter right now.
It sounds like you get to choose a lot of things that you enjoy doing, which is always good. That's always the part, is that we should be really focusing on, doing the best things we enjoy and making the most out of it as possible. So,
Indeed. And I frequently, note the fact that that the options that I've been able to kind of take advantage of, having been doing operations for many, many, many years, now moved to strategy, still with a finger and a pulse on operations. I think it's a great tie-in, and I'm very lucky to be able to do that.
Absolutely fantastic. And one of the big topic for today's episode is really using all your vast experience, especially the years of being in the CISO and being in the forefront, especially during a time when that was really taking off, becoming an important role. To now, as you're spending a lot of times on the executive board side, so a little bit of both sides, which I'm going to really kind of use that knowledge that you have today. It's really how CISOs can be successful, what things need to be measuring. What strategies should they be prioritizing? So that's the main theme of today's episode. And also kind of what's the best way to communicate with the board, how to get their support to do the things that you really need to be successful. So what was your journey into being a CISO like? I mean, it was really in the early years of CISOs becoming established. What was that like at the time?
So I will admit that my journey to become a CISO was not ordinary in any way, shape, or form. And, I know that some of the listeners have probably heard this before regarding the importance of being a very business-centric technologist and a
Mhm.
business-centric executive to be an effective CISO. In my journey, I actually started my career early on in the business. I was actually
Mhm.
not in the technology space. Longer story for another podcast, how that pivoted to joining the technology sector and being part of a leadership group in technology. But the early days of my career were not in cyber and they were
Mhm.
not security. They were more in product development, software engineering, and integration. And, through working through a number of organizations, one in particular that was in the financial services industry, quickly learned that security in that
Mhm.
industry was everyone's responsibility. So, in a way, there was a significant amount of security experience that my technology experience would be able to provide. But I became a CISO kind of by accident. I had an opportunity at one organization where the individual that I was working for, reporting to, came to me somewhat in haste and said, I've got a crisis. I've
Mhm.
got repeat audit findings. I've got a challenge within the security practice and I really need you to take it over. And I was like, what? Not my thing. Now I'm going to date myself. This was back in 2004.
Well, okay.
And it was before we even called it cyber, to be honest
Uh,
with you. But he asked me to take it over and I was very hesitant. I kind of thought that it was a dead end and oh my God, this is going to be terrible. But it was one of the best career moves that I ever made that I didn't make for myself. And I like saying that because I was kind of forced into the role. It was incredibly insightful that the reason why I was asked to take that role was because I already had very strong relationships with all of the business leaders in the organization. And they felt that for me to culturally change the way people looked at security and was engaged in security, that would be a very successful trade. Hands down, it was,
Mhm.
and created an opportunity for me in the cybersecurity space ever since. So, I truly believe that my journey as a business individual, then a tech individual, then
Mhm.
security, kind of blending those three type of competencies really made a big difference. And it was really about managing business related relationships so that I could have support when I wanted to make a change or force a piece of technology that we felt very strongly about that would improve our risk posture and our ability to defend the organization. It really came down to having these business people rally around it and feel that they were a part of it. It wasn't a band-aid, it wasn't a push down, etc. But that's kind of my journey. And in my last CISO role at Comcast, we kind of built upon that, and we even had what we called ISOs at the time, and
Yeah, yeah.
organizations have them as well, where there was a business liaison into
Mm.
very large business leaders and competency areas to kind of bring that mesh together and that prioritization together. And I think it's been a very healthy practice that many organizations have adopted.
So I think that's a really huge, important area is that, we're not there just to focus on technology and focus on, securing organization. It's really important for CISOs to have that business understanding and business acumen because ultimately we're not there just for the sake of security. We're there to support the business value. And it's really important to be aligned. I think that's also why we're seeing a lot of the kind of the rise of the BISOs as well, who are really focused, business information security officers who are focused organizations who have so many lines of business that it's really a challenge for one CISO to kind of be across all and also to have relationships into each of those different lines of business. You find even things like pharmaceutical companies that might have hardware, that might have software, they might have chemical, bio, different divisions, and they need to manage them separately. So having people that understand each of those businesses is critical. And that was actually one of my own kind of lessons as well, because for many years I always assumed that I was a cybersecurity professional, but I realized very quickly that that's my skill set. It's not necessarily the result of what I do is about helping organizations become resilient. It's about understanding how can you help the business be successful? How can you help the employees be successful? Because ultimately that's actually how you measure security is the organization be able to continue providing services. So, your background is that, it's a really perfect mixture of, having the business understanding and having a good understanding and great understanding from the IT perspective, and then moving into security, because it just becomes another area of that kind of protection resilience for the organization. What was some of the ways that you kind of what was some of your top strategies or priorities? How did you look at your day to day, what would your day to day kind of activity look like? Who would you interact with within the organization? So what would that kind of turn into?
So day to day was never the same. I'll give you that. Day to day was never the same. Every day was a new day. While I sat in seat as the global CISO at Comcast, we had 54 different businesses. So to
Oh,
give you kind of like the
that's
landscape. And a lot of people don't realize that about the organization. I mean, it is a massive conglomerate. Most individuals know the organization for, video distribution,
yeah,
high speed data, etc. But we had, and I still say we, once part
yeah.
of a team, always part of a team. We had, we bought NBC Universal, we had, broadcast stations, we had media outlets, we had theme parks, we had retail, we had so many different things and things that nobody even knew that the organization was behind.
Mhm.
So for me, I was very fortunate to have built an organization that had tentacles into all of these different businesses, managed a 24/7 security operations center that kind of governed and managed the entire enterprise, and what we call a service delivery network
Mhm.
that served about 26 million customers.
Mhm.
So my day to day would be very, very driven by current circumstances, right? Are we currently experiencing a high volume number of alerts and events in the service delivery network? My interchange could be with my operations leader in that capacity, to dealing with our governmental affairs group because we were actually influencing,
Mhm.
regulatory frameworks for the industry, to working directly with my chief risk officer for the corporation around our risk posture. So the day to day varied a great deal. I will say that outside of event driven activity, because
Mhm.
it will happen, outside of event driven activity, my role was really about being a risk executive for the organization, to the point
Mhm.
you made before, managing priorities of the advancements that we would do technologically and procedurally, but always overlaying that with the priorities of the business. And when you have 54 different businesses, those priorities will fluctuate a great deal. And it wouldn't surprise anyone that obviously the higher revenue generating businesses, the larger
Yeah.
entities that had a lot of consumer facing and publicly facing kind of circumstances, would drive a lot of the priorities. But
Mhm.
one thing that I kind of coined it many, many years ago, and kind of had every single member of my team kind of carry this kind of mission statement, is our goal was to protect the brand,
Yeah.
full stop, right? And protecting the brand could range from, external security protections to data classification to identities and privilege access areas, etc., and really building a very analytical framework
Mhm.
so that we could be very much educated on what the value proposition would be when we would adopt something, or to modify a procedure, or to adjust the policy. So it really varied a great deal. But what I enjoyed the most is working with the different business leaders over time, which I felt was one of the, it was a great, I mean, it validated all of the energy that we put in when I would have business leaders call me and say, "Hey, I want your team in this product definition meeting,
Mhm.
or I want your team in this merger and acquisition discussion, or hey, I want your team." And, the top of the top is when I would have business leaders speaking about the importance of cyber and protecting the brand without any influence. It was just like feather in the
That's
cap.
that's fantastic because I think to your point is that ultimately we're there. I've heard different kind of variations. The brand protectors to the revenue protectors to the resilient side of things across kind of how security is being measured today.
Sure.
And I think you brought up a really important point is when you get the business being proactive. That's really when you've made the change of not just doing security for the sake of awareness, but also doing it for actually it becomes a part of the culture and DNA of the organization. And when
Yeah.
you get to the organization having a security culture, that's where you get the business being proactive, and they start reaching out and they start wanting you involved in things like acquisitions of organizations, or deploying new technologies or new services as new lines of business. They start being proactive, And the more proactive you get, the earlier you get security involved in that process, one is it saves a lot of, pain later for many businesses, because putting security on at that's why I always like, when DNA studies, with CISO talked about security by design. I really like that emphasis. And I also like, my preference would be security by default. It's the kind of the default option, but security by design is important kind of starting point of that journey.
Yeah.
And the other thing you mentioned,
I will add to that. I apologize. I didn't want to, but I will add to that that is kind of the precipice of getting the support that you need, right? And when you've built that culture and you have the business leaders kind of thinking about security and outreach, now when you're looking for resources and financial support and you're trying to kind of build a portfolio of activities to kind of continue to increase the security landscape and to manage the risk posture, now it doesn't feel like you're out there on an island by yourself begging for dollars and resources. You have that kind of relationship, and that synergy just changes the dynamics.
And it becomes a shared responsibility in the end as well, because ultimately it's not, because a lot of times in the past it's been finger pointing. That's IT or security's problem. They have to deal with it. But we have to kind of get over that historical kind of assumption. It's not an IT, it's not a security problem, it's a business problem. And we all have to have shared responsibility. We all have to work together. And I really liked when you said that, that the business leaders and those who you were providing services to became advocates. That was a massive turning point even for me when I realized, I remember doing many years ago, it was a security awareness training. And I realized that actually, if the message is coming from me, sometimes it's seen as, from somebody else. If I can get people within the business to communicate it, and that was really the starting point of, we sometimes call them cyber ambassadors or, security advocates, or, it's really those within the business who share it with their peers. They listen more. It's coming from somebody within the same vocabulary, the same communication, the same speak. I always found that was much stronger message than it was coming from security. And if you get those advocates, if you get those ambassadors, that's when you really start realizing that, yes, to your point, it becomes easier to get the resources and budget, because they start realizing that it's helping them be successful. It's helping them be resilient. And that becomes a major, major difference, especially for a CISO going to the board and, being able to, show that there's none of the silos anymore. It's about collaborating. It's about working together.
Indeed. My biggest advocate was the head of HR. he was just amazing. He would do videos for awareness, and you'd hear him on stage and make these comments. But to the point that you were just making, and I know we want to talk a little bit about the board dynamic, which is critically important today, is when those business leaders are now speaking on your behalf, when they're in presentation mode to the board. That's another really big step in building that shared collaboration, shared responsibility, and it no longer becomes that team's responsibility alone. And I think what many folks, those that interact with their boards, assuming that they have a public board and even a private board, they're seeing the board members look at this area very differently than they did 10 years ago, 15 years ago, et cetera. Every board member in America is being kind of ingrained that this is a board level imperative, that there is liability and responsibility at the board level to make sure that they are governing the organization's strategy and governing the organization's priorities and risks to make sure that this is a top priority while balancing all the other things that they have to do to kind of be effective board members to a business. So I kind of feel like this is a really big renaissance period for CISOs, for security owners, and other technological leadership owners in the boardroom, where, it's not just, hey, let's talk about the next fancy digital transformation or the next fancy blah, blah, blah. People are asking, what are we doing about our data? What are we doing about access? How do we know how effective we are in our security program? What is our relationships, right? What are our relationships with, law enforcement? And do we have these opportunities to kind of share knowledge, et cetera? Super important. I mean, I remember when I was a CISO, and I presented to my board. I was fortunate that I had a board member who came from the banking industry, and of course, the banking industry has been a leader
Yep.
in this space. And he would ask me some really great questions about the program and would allow me that platform to kind of share what we were doing for the rest of the board. Now, as I sit in the boardroom, now I'm like at the opposite seat, I'm leveraging that type of knowledge to assist the CISO and to assist others in being able to kind of bring out their value story and their value proposition so that my fellow board members can appreciate the topical comments. And what I've seen over time is I don't have to be the one to ask those questions anymore. Now others are becoming much more comfortable with the topic and just as supportive.
That's fantastic. I think you just brought it, kind of reminded me of an important, area of convergence as well, is that we can learn a lot. I think one of the areas that we're seeing is the security industry and the financial industry can learn a lot from each other, because in the financial side, they understand a lot about financial crimes and how to measure it and how to detect it. And there's that convergence because we're, many times dealing with digital crimes, and the financial has a component, and we've been too separated for too long. I think there's a lot to learn by understanding a lot about the financial side, because they have a lot of the insights. And one thing I wanted to ask you about from the board side is that I learned quite a lot last year. There's a big difference between when you're presenting down from a CISO to the organization versus presenting up to the board. I attended a workshop last year with John Chambers, which was very insightful. I really enjoyed it. It was about quantifying risk, the workshop. And one of the things I was asking was, about what was his recommendations about presenting to the board. He said that typically when you're presenting down to the organization, you have your basically slides, you've got your basically what your kind of summary, what you want to share. You've got your metrics about how you come to those conclusions, and then you've got your asks that you're wanting to get at the end. And John and his counterpart Michael was when you're doing it to the board level, don't start with all the fluff. He just said, get straight to the point and present your asks. And they have the questions, then people will ask for context later. So what's your recommendation? How should CISOs present to the board? How should they, be able to get, because, how much time do you typically get? Maybe 10, 15 minutes maximum, if you're lucky.
Yeah.
So what's your recommendations to communication and to really get the board supporting you in regards to the initiatives?
Yeah. So as you may imagine, my response is going to be, it depends, but I'm going to give you a couple of analogies and scenarios. First and foremost, for the organizations that I serve on the board of, luckily they get more than 10 minutes because I make it a pretty important topic. And our boards are very much inclined to how important this is. So that's a good thing.
Yeah.
But it would depend. It depends on the maturity of the organization. Like, where are they in their journey? How much exposure has the company had to cybersecurity incidents? Have they had, industry incidents within the industry? In highly regulated organizations, you're going to see a very different cadence. But John, incredible leader, love him to death, and he's spot on, right? You have to be able to communicate to the board with less fluff, more of kind of like the reality of where we are as an organization. And oh, by the way, I often say, don't be a weather reporter. Like, don't tell me stuff and this, that, and the other. Give me a very good perspective of how you and the organization believes their posture is as far as defending the organization. And it's not always comfortable for CISOs to come to the board and say, we have some challenges, and here are the areas where we believe we have some weaknesses. But I would encourage you to be extremely transparent about the reality of your posture. Some organizations want dashboards and metrics and reportings, and I do think that some of that is very important because there's a look back period, so you can understand, are we any better than we were before? But I would recommend a lot of that's appendix material. Right?
Yeah. It's the end. If you have questions, we can cover that.
Exactly. But I would recommend presenting where you are from a cybersecurity posture and what does it mean to the business.
Yep.
There are many different controls that we as security professionals care very deeply about because we understand the domino effect of weaknesses. And we understand the domino effect of different vectors that could become problematic for us from a vulnerability perspective. Trying to get your board to understand that domino effect and all of those different is very difficult. I think you have to keep it at a macro level, but with the appropriate asks and the appropriate planning. In other words, it's fine to report that maybe it's cloudy in this area of the business, but here's what we're doing about it. Here's where our priorities are. And by the way, some of those priorities need to be process related, right? So we want to manage, how many technological investments that we're going to present to say we're doing X, Y, Z. Now we need those, full stop, right? So logically, the more advanced our programs are, the more automation that exists, the more data and the analytics exists, the more important it is. But don't overwhelm your board with just technology, because what they're hearing outside of the boardroom is a massive amount of spend and not enough residual value. And that will lead me to the other component. You have to find a way, and again, depends on the company, the maturity, the industry, the sector, all of that. How do you articulate that residual value proposition? If we do the following, we will improve our posture by X, or we will improve our ability to respond, or we will improve our ability to recover. And I think that's a really very important aspect. When we think about our journey in security, we had the protection mode, we had the detection mode, and then we had response. And I like to call it containment, right? How quickly could we contain an event? That's actually more important to me as a board member than whether or not I'm fully patched across the enterprise, or if I have certain endpoints that kind of fall out of the control sector. So I want to know, how quickly can we detect? How quickly can we contain? And some of that presented to the board, that you are open to third-party assessments, I think is super important. A third party could be one of your technology partners.
Absolutely.
I'm very aware that Delinea has had an opportunity to kind of assist customers to say, here, let's do an assessment of how you're managing privilege access. Here's, kind of how you can present the changes via technology implementation and process. So I think those are really important for board members to understand. But last but not least, talk to them in business language. What does it mean? When you're able to articulate a scenario, what it means to the business, even if it's as simple as we are down from being able to operate for X number of hours.
And what does down mean? What's the impact to the business? Does that mean the service you're providing doesn't continue? And that service probably has a dollar figure tied to it. So you can calculate, if we're down for X days, this is how much the business will lose from that.
That's right. And turn the conversation. Yes, it is about securing. Yes, it's about defending. But turn the conversation to resiliency. So there is that kind of like gravitational lead up to resiliency. But I do feel, and I have to say this is not a commercial, but I do feel that many CISOs, I say CISOs, other leaders in the stack, have a huge opportunity to talk about kind of the root cause of issues, right? So we have incidents and we have root cause back. And out of all of the breaches, you end up coming right back to an access issue, right?
Yep.
And if you were able to manage that access, you could immediately share with your board, I can prevent this by X%, because the access route will be managed, contained, restricted, opened up for business, etc. I think there's a huge opportunity to talk to your board.
Absolutely.
In that context.
Absolutely. I think even if you can look at, you look at the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report, it shows over the last 10 years of cumulative of all of the incidents that they've analyzed, 1/3 of those comes down to identity-related compromise.
Data.
I always love when Jason Haddox talks about the Ubisoft breach, that basically out of the massive cost to Ubisoft of that breach was resulted from basically a stolen credential that was sold on the dark web for something like $10. I mean, that's it comes shocking that that entry point leads to a massive impact to the business. Actually, one of the lessons I've learned over the years is that, I was fortunate enough when one of kind of the industries I worked in was into emergency services. And this is how I always relate to, the impact is I worked for the ambulance service for many years. If to your point, is that when somebody calls, the emergency number, how quickly can you get an ambulance to that person? That becomes basically a massive service level. And on average, if the ambulance didn't make it to that person in 21 minutes, this is always something that's always ingrained in my head, these are SLAs. 21 minutes was a massive difference between the likeliness of that person dying and being surviving. 21 minutes, ambulance getting to the scene of an accident. Then you have what services that ambulance can provide, the detection, the capabilities of remediation to provide. And there's another SLA of getting that person to the emergency room. How quickly can you get them to the emergency room? And then, of course, that's the, basically, what's the operation procedure to get that person into stability. So I always use those kind of, scenarios, even the fire service as well, have the same thing is how quickly can that detectors, detect smoke. And if you can detect smoke earlier before, the fire happens, then you minimize the impact, the damage you can have from a fire. So you always get into is thinking about from a business perspective is what's the potential business impact or what's the impact of the service you're providing and leading to that. And if the business was down for one day, here's the amount, and here's our confidence level of our current capabilities is that we can detect it within X amount of time. So therefore, likely the business could, even ransomware cases I worked on, a large transportation company, the impact of ransomware to their business was that they had a business completely stoppage for 1 month. They could not provide any services for 1 month. So that was their financial cost to that business was 1 month of services. And that runs into the millions. And then you get into, they had partial services for 2 more months, meaning that they couldn't provide, a lot of the full capabilities. So there's that hard financial cost. And absolutely what you're, if you can lead with that, that's, if you can have more resiliency, you can reduce that time down. If you have better detection, you reduce that cost down as well. And that's really, I think, when you're kind of mentioning is the business understanding helps you narrate that to the executive team. It helps you communicate it and get the point across. So if you can talk in business terms, it's a huge advantage for CISOs.
Yeah, you summarize it perfectly, and I would encourage CISOs to have those conversations with their board, and it could very well be a combined effort with whoever is managing enterprise risk, and kind of having these scenarios and pulse check. I mean, we assume a lot, like as security leaders, we assume a lot, and it will vary by industry, it will vary by maturity, it will vary by impact on the regulatory frameworks, etc. I can easily say that for one of my organizations that I serve on a board on, we've had this discussion and basically built the thresholds to say we cannot have an outage of X period of time. We cannot have this function be out of service for our customers and this, that, and the other. And that provides kind of the context for boards to understand, like, okay, well, that little chart with that, mean time to detection and the incident rates and this and the other. Yes, very important. But what does it mean to me? Does it mean that we would be in trouble if we had an incident? So having that type of conversation, and then having your board members and your executive committee kind of react to their tolerance thresholds, right?
Yes.
Like, don't be surprised that someone may particularly say, well, I'm okay if we had a 12-hour incident. None of my companies would agree to that, but I'm just saying there could be one. But the reality is that things are going to happen. We know that the resilience is the most important item, but then you're going to have to address, which I know everyone that's listening, this is what they do day to day. You have to address what are the things that we can do to minimize our probabilities. And I will go back. And the statistic that you just shared, thank you for sharing it. It comes down to access. I mean, we could do 1,000 different things, but if we're not managing our access to some of the most critical functions, applications, I'll call them, machine level accounts. It doesn't necessarily have to be a human being. that really has such a large swath of increasing your
Hmm.
probabilities of being successful and not being in that incident range to begin with. I think that that's a really good way because board members will hear things like, this is a war we're never going to win. Well,
Hmm.
okay, maybe you're right. We're never going to win, but we have to be prepared and we have to manage our risk profile and our probabilities.
Absolutely. How much does it take for the business to survive
That's right.
and continue? And how much are you willing to put aside? In those situations, so you're going to get the financial safety net of cyber insurance or cyber captives or other mechanisms to help you kind of make sure you've got enough to cover the costs. And you look at the average cost is like in the millions. We look at some of the larger breaches; it's in hundreds of millions. So there's a massive kind of financial impact if organizations do get breached. I think it's also important kind of when you talk about those initial compromises, many organizations, they sometimes over focus on the front door of the organization, the initial access. But when we look at actually the majority of the major impacts to organizations is on the internal of the networks. It's they don't segregate, let's say, privileged users from privileged users. They don't have a good separation of duties in that area. And ultimately means when that initial access is being breached, organizations sometimes make it too easy for the attackers to move around, to laterally move, to elevate privileges. And that's the big area that causes the most damage, is when they gain access to higher level accounts that has access to sensitive data that allows them to exfiltrate that data out, to deploy malicious software and to bring the organization to complete standstill. It's that, to your point, I really like when you mentioned the domino effect. It's literally is that that initial access is that domino first falling, but what's the last domino and how big is that domino when it falls? And what type of financial impact does that domino that falls at the end have to the business? Because that initial access might be a stolen credential or a compromised password, but that domino at the end might be your ERP system. It could be
That's
your
right.
third party. It could be your entire, let's say, if you're a law firm, it could be all your intellectual kind of sensitive notes on your clients. So what is that? What's that thing you're protecting, and what's that thing that's right at the front that can lead to that?
Yeah. I'm going to predict, I
Mhm.
don't do this too often, but I'm going to predict that as I look at kind of and we're talking board level
Mhm.
interactions and this, that, and the other, this way, I want to make this statement. I'm going to predict that with the recent disclosure changes that the
Mhm.
SEC is requiring of companies to do, there are a number of things that are going to happen. And one is just the fact that there is a mandatory disclosure on materiality. There's a mandatory disclosure on describing your program.
Mhm.
I predict two things. One is not yet because there hasn't been enough time, but I predict that there are going to be, I'm going to call them pundits. There's going to be
Mhm.
entities out there that are going to be reviewing the descriptions of cybersecurity programs in their case. And they're going to basically say, hey, company XYZ, what are
Mhm.
you doing about access? What are you doing about credentials? What are you doing about rights of privileged users within your organization?
Mhm.
And you mentioned it, third parties, right? The third parties that actually interact, etc. So right now, there's a varying level of detail in the program summary that
Mhm.
is being pushed out there. And that's okay because, there's no reason for you to give your external adversaries too much information
Mhm.
that could be weaponized against you. But I do predict that there's going to be a little bit of a tug of war on asking questions around these things. And the reason is that as companies continue to disclose incidents and
Mhm.
companies continue to disclose that the root cause was what we just said,
Yeah.
a credential that was harvested, compromised, lateral movements within the organization, and the ability to penetrate certain systems, it's going to have this cycle effect to say, what are you doing about this control point? Um,
Absolutely.
the second prediction that I have is there's going to be a little bit of a tug of war around the degree of information that the board is going to ask for. It's going to go from my recommendation of keep it macro, keep it
Mhm.
business
Mhm.
centric, and then there's going to be the firefight when there's a problem.
Mhm.
They go way down into the weeds, and then boards are going to be asking very specific questions like,
Mhm.
well, how did we let that happen? Like,
Yep.
how did we let Joe Smith privileged access user, how do we let that credential do as much as it did for as long as it did without knowing about it and without being able to contain it, right? Now, I predict that those are going to be some of the things that are going to be push-pull. We'll see what happens with some more SEC-related disclosure requirements. And for the listeners that are out there, this is a hard topic, right? Because we have users that do a ton of work for our organizations that have elevated credentials, and they feel very strongly they need these credentials to do their jobs. And the last thing that we want to do is have them feel that they're being kind of handcuffed.
Reducing productivity, they so they can't do their job, and it's sometimes that's a kind of a cultural kind of behavioral change. Sometimes they can still do their job, but it might be just through a more controlled method.
That's right.
And I think one of the things two massive rising trends that I've seen in the industry is the identity security posture management, which is a massive area of organizations wanting to know what is our current posture of managing identities. So that's a converging kind of multiple technologies, privileged access to GRC, to IGA, to all of those converging ITDR coming to get be able to what is our current posture today. And then the other area of massive growth I've seen for Ryan's and it becoming a big topic is data security posture management. Is okay now one of those identities is what's our current status on data. It's not just about thinking about data, encryption and data privacy and data security, but it's ultimately understanding about what is the valuable data, what's the assessment we have, and how do we make sure we protect that. So those are two areas I'm seeing, on the massive rise and being very topical because it is a converging area. But they realize that it's all about in the world we live in today, where it's moved from bring your own device to bring your own office to bring your own identity. That's how do we protect the valuable resources of organizations? It's all about understanding the identity and access and understanding the data. And how do you make sure that people can stay productive, but in a safe way?
That's right. That's right. And the correlation between identity and data, not only from data collection, utilization, et cetera, but that correlation of and I would use the term heuristics, right? Why is this identity actually either utilizing, extracting, moving, whatever you want to call it, this layer of data elements, and that should be an opportunity to monitor and understand a little bit more and learn kind of the analytical behavioral elements of the variety of credentials and identities. I think that those two areas are critically important for any program. And really, if we think about where our infrastructure is gone, and continues to go, those elements are going to be critical for us for the next decade or so.
And everything's moving to just-in-time. We just-in-time everything, just-in-time infrastructure, just-in-time code, just-in-time access. It's all moving to as we need it. A bit like the logistics and supply chain industry move to just-in-time. As people need it, we add more resources. Just like electricity is, the more you need, the more they can provide. And that's where organizations are getting to, because it was much more of a that you're not overspending, you're just consuming just as much as you need to from a resource perspective. It's been awesome having you on. I would like, for the audience, what resources do you use? Is there any books that you recommend, or, ways of, how you keep up to date? What resources do you recommend the audience in order to help them, find what's something of educational or that they can leverage to be successful in their career?
So I'm an avid reader of any security related newsletter. Right? And we get bombarded by many of them, but I'm an avid reader, and I spend at least an hour a day just going through kind of recent posts for the various periodicals that all of the listeners on this podcast will be familiar with. But to add to that, I spent a lot of time educating myself, and I would encourage the readers to do so as well, is read about things that the National Association of Corporate Directors puts out regarding cybersecurity. And you don't have to be a member to get access to some of the publications. Also be very familiar with kind of like the enterprise risk management principles. I do think that that's an area where a lot of CISOs can interact. The principles of ERM, the way your company articulate CRM to the board and to be able to kind of weave yourself in there if you're not already in there. But last but not least, I've had a number of, and I won't name one because then I'll hurt another, but a ton of really great CISO books this last
Absolutely.
year and a half. It's always great to understand what people have been able to manage through and their lessons. So for your listeners, I think there's a plethora of data. I think if anybody went to the RSA, they saw the publication and they were big up on this. But current, I read the home security, the Homeland Security newsletter. Super important for me because of my critical infrastructure pieces to understand what's happening, what the intelligence is there. Those of you that are part of the ISACs, again, another very consumable method of knowledge sharing. We're not short of those opportunities. But last but not least, there's nothing more powerful than collaborating with your peers. It really is.
Absolutely. Networking. That's actually, I mean, one of the things is for CISOs, having a good community and network around you is so critical. And having people to go to advice, even for myself, there's always, people I've met over the years that I'm always going to. If something that I know that they have experience of, had knowledge of in the past, that I would go to them and always, I think it's one of the most powerful things. I remember sitting around a table with law enforcement, and it was all about parents and children and law enforcement, how they can protect school, kids at school. And I think one of the things that came to mind, I was put on the spot. What would piece of advice I would leave the audience that would make a difference tomorrow? And it was not to be afraid to ask for advice. It was one of the things, and I think that's key today. Still is have people you can go to, who are mentors, who can get you, and the community is what provides that. I think it still exists, and it's still very powerful. And I think most of us, even myself and you, would probably have peers that we've worked with over the years that are our go-to people. So,
absolutely. I mean, we when I say we, the community that both you and I are a part of, whenever there's an opportunity to collaborate, break bread with one another, just have a very candid conversation of what they're experiencing, and to be able to compare notes, what's working, what's not, what's on your mind. I think that's probably the most valuable source. And I say that selfishly because I hope to do a few. I do a few leadership dinners a year. I'm looking forward to doing a few more before 2024 ends, and hopefully some of your listeners will be a part of that.
Absolutely. I mean, if anyone has any questions or would like to contact you or reach out for advice, what's the best way for them to contact you?
Best way to reach me is on LinkedIn.
Fantastic. So we'll make sure that if it's okay, we can put your LinkedIn onto the show notes at a later stage. So many thanks. It's been awesome having you on, and really, enlightening. And for me, it's, this is an area that I want to learn more about, is more of that kind of board interactions, more about how to be successful, and just learning from awesome people like yourself. You've been a rock star in the industry, and really setting that, that yes, it's, that for people out there that's aspiring to be a CISO, that you're really showing them that's a journey that they can go on. So many thanks for being on the show.
No, thank you, Joe, and thank you for all you do. This podcast is amazing.
Many thanks. It's a pleasure. And for the audience, this is, podcast is created for you. It's, Delinea have enabled me to deliver these podcasts on a bi-weekly basis. So every 2 weeks, I think we're close to, over 115 episodes now. So it's pretty amazing. And with, over 350,000 plus listens over the years we've been doing this. So we really want to make sure that we're continuing to bring awesome guests on to share their experience, share their knowledge, to help take you on a journey to help you be successful. So again, tune in every 2 weeks, subscribe to the podcast, go and take a look at us on the website, check out all the other resources we have. Stay safe, take care, and all the best until the next show. So all the best, and thank you.
You too.